Suganya Anandakichenin holds a PhD in Indology from the University of Hamburg. She has worked as a research scholar in projects involving Tamil literature, and she specialized in Vaiṣṇavism in the Tamil land, from the Āḻvār poetry in Tamil to Sri Vaishnava theology in Manipurabala, and everything in between. She's currently undergoing traditional training to read Vaiṣṇavic texts under a Sri Vaisṇavacharya. Apart from publishing articles and co-editing 2 volumes on various Indological topics, she has also published a monograph on Kulashekar Āḻvār, which includes a philological translation of his work of the medieval commentary, and getting ready for publication her next book on the commentary traditions of the medieval Vaishnava, Sri Vaishnavacharyas. So please, Suganya, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ricardo. Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here today. I'd like to share the screen. Let's see what happens now. Okay, I think I just need to start a presenter view. Okay, can you see?
Yes.
Okay, good. So I'm going to talk about the Āḻvār's concept of God today, and I'm going to try my best not to do it from the perspective of the Sri Vaishnava Acharyas, because often that's what's done. There you go. So before I begin, I think I would like to read this verse. Aanallan pennallan Allah aliyum allan kaanalum ahan ulan allan illai allan penum kaal penum uruvahum allanum am. That's the first and last time I'm going to read out in Tamil, don't worry. So he is neither man nor woman, nor is he a hermaphrodite who's neither. He cannot be seen. He does not exist. He does not exist. When worshipped, he is of the form desired by the worshipper. He is not that either. Speaking of our Lord is fraught with much difficulty. Thus says Nammarva, one of the most prominent saint poets ever to have lived. Is God difficult for him to know and speak of? Well, here in this quotation, he says that it is difficult for anyone to know his nature. And then he goes on to say, it's even difficult for gods like Shiva and Brahma. And why is it so? Finally, he says that's because he himself does not know of his nature, despite being, he says, the father and the mother of gods. So are the Āḻvārs going to be so tongue-tied that we can't know about how they conceive God? Is he then anirvachaniya, achintaniya? Well, thankfully, not quite, as we shall say. So let's now move on to the beginning. This is the proper beginning, where I would like to say a few words about the Āḻvārs. I'm sure everybody knows about them, but still one never knows. So actually, I was hoping to focus on these 2 Āḻvārs, but I realized that I wouldn't be able to give an overall view of how the Āḻvārs saw and understood God. So I'm going to use any pertinent verse by any of the Āḻvār, and suddenly I found myself dealing with 4,000 verses by 12 different people. And sometimes even within the verses of the same corpus, the same Āḻvār expresses a nuanced view of God. So think about what happens when there are so many verses and so many people dealing with them. Anyway, I'm going to try to do my best. So what I was going to say is that there are 12 Āḻvārs. As I said, they are believed to have lived between the 6th and 9th centuries, and they composed around 4,000 verses in Tamil. And these were compiled around the 10th century and named the Nalayira Divya Prabantham. So those are 4,000 divine compositions. And something I wanted to mention before I move on, because I'm not going to get into that later, is that these Āḻvārs were clearly well-read. They definitely knew their itihasas, their Upanishads, and whatever Purana already existed, and possibly some of the Pancharatra Agamas as well, although that's very hard to assess, I think. And they likely influenced some of the later Pancharatra Agamas as well, and definitely the Bhakti works in turn. And they also definitely knew classical Tamil poetry. And their concept of God is likely to have been very much influenced by these texts, and they had their own views, obviously, of course. Okay, so who is the Āḻvār's God? Now, all the Āḻvārs were devoted to Narayana. I avoid intentionally the word Vishnu because they don't actually call him that all that very often. I think Catherine Young has written something about that. And yet they claim that he has 1,000 names, clearly epithets that describe him and his different forms, qualities, and activities. For Narayana has different forms. We all know that, Krishna, Rama, etc. And we shall focus on that in a minute. And the Āḻvār's devotion acquires a different shades depending on their own temperament, of course, but also on the form that they choose. For example, Andar here, the soul woman, and her father here, Periyarva, both of them were devoted to Krishna, but her bhakti was more of a romantic kind, whereas Periyarva's was more like a parental kind of love that he felt. And when they worship God in a shrine, because that also happens quite a lot, especially in the later period, the Āḻvārs tend to treat God as a king, and sometimes they consider him as the father. And of course, the master-servant relationship is often mentioned as well. But why were these Āḻvārs so devoted to Narayana? Well, from their verses, it seems that the predominant reasons for much of their attraction to him are his attributes, both physical and otherwise, as hopefully we shall see. But what are those attributes? Do they make God the perfect being? So if he's a perfect being, is it possible to know him fully? We've already seen a verse that I just quoted. Is it possible to know him fully as he is, especially if he is the perfect being? Can he be known by mere imperfect human beings? And was their devotion single-minded, since monotheism can often be a very relative concept? These are some questions that I'd like to deal with here. These aren't necessarily questions that I've been thinking of for a long time. So some of them I'm still working on. So there you go. And I'm going to do that in this order. Very simplistic, but hopefully I'll be able to say what I have to say. So to begin with, God's forms and functions. So clearly the Āḻvārs praise God in his many forms, but they clearly understand they are dealing with one and the same God in different forms, obviously. So some of these forms are linked to some locations. For example, there are the far away locations, like there is the Vaikuntha, where God is the king of the celestials. He sits as a king in court, and then there is the milk ocean. And then far in terms of time are the Avataras. I mean, the Āḻvārs may have lived not very far away from Krishna, where Krishna lived, but he doesn't live there anymore. And then there are the closer forms, not quite so transcendental. I'm not going to use that word. The God inside. So I was going to say inner controller, but they don't use that term. So it's the Lord in the heart that they call him. That's very close. And then there is one of their favorites, that's the murti, the image, the icon in the shrine. And in this case, God is very, very close as well. And what's more, unlike with God in the heart, this form of God allows you to have an external vision, a vision outside you, the thing you can really have a real good glimpse of God in that way. I was just going to mention very, very quickly that this seems to correspond roughly to the fivefold theory of emanations in Pancharatra. Pancharatra is a hornet's nest, I think. I won't dwell into that very often, not here either. So there is the Para, Vyuha, Vibhava, Antaryami, Archa, but I realized that it's not found in the older text. I had a word about this with Marion Resteli, and the list did not always include these 5 elements, etc. I won't get into this, just so that the modern Sri Vaishnavas definitely see a parallel between these two. Now, to move on, I'd just like to have a quick look individually at these different forms. Now, the supreme form corresponds to Narayana's transcendental form in Vaikuntha. Not everybody can see him, only those who are liberated. Actually, I'll be giving all these quotations, and in blue you will find my translations, but most often, unfortunately, I won't be reading them. Fortunately for you, depends on how you see this. Anyway, what I wanted to say is the Āḻvārs express a wish to reach Vaikuntha. You can see that in that quotation, and because that is the locus of liberation for them. And they also say sometimes, oh, if you're going to recite my verses, that way you will reach Vaikuntha for sure. So that's the Palashruti for reciting their works. And then comes the milk ocean. They clearly say that they also see this as the supreme form of God. He is in his yoga nidra. They also mention the word explicitly. And some of the Āḻvārs definitely say that he is, the supreme being even that. But then they use that also for Ranganatha, for example. But nothing is actually quite clear cut. It seems that all these forms as we will see, sort of merge into each other in their minds. Okay. So, and then come the Avataras. Like literally, there are thousands of references to them, some more popular than the others, depending on the time during which they lived, the individual preferences of the Āḻvārs. They describe the different avatars and load their activities, which mostly consist in destroying the bad guys and protecting the good. But of course, sometimes these activities correspond to neither, but produce delight in the poet and presumably the reader, the listener. I was going to say reader, but actually it's listener. For example, Periyava composes Pilaytamil, which is a genre in which he describes Krishna's every childhood activity. Well, he's not, destroying the bad guys or protecting anyone. It's just being very charming. And then we pass on to the inner controller. I've put dweller, but controller, fine, why not? It seems some of the early Āḻvārs address more God in their hearts. The later ones also do, but it seems, for example, Tirumarisai Āḻvār, one of the very early Āḻvārs, does that. In this verse, for example, he goes to the extent of claiming that God wouldn't want to stay elsewhere now that he has stayed in Tirumarisai's heart, a most superior place, surely. So he says, he who is my ruler from Rangam guards me against reaching the stage of the world. Again, there's a play of words with Ranga here. He stands and sits in my heart. Will he then recline on the serpent bed on the sea? So what he's trying to say, I think, is that by moving to the devotee's heart, God will make sure that the Āḻvār doesn't get back to this world again. So he comes to the devotee's heart to transport the devotee with him to his abode, i.e. liberation, which is also, I would tend to think, his mission in his iconic forms. He is coming to the people here in this world to take them away from this world. And then finally, there is the murti, the image, the icon, which the Pancharatrins would refer to as archa murtis. So these icons of deities are just as popular as the avataras, perhaps even more. They're not just representations of God for the Āḻvārs, but God himself in a more accessible form. I don't ever remember seeing them describe with what material a certain statue is made. No, never. Although they describe the landscape, the shrine, the decorations upon God, etc. And I think that their popularity is probably due to the fact that he is now a local God, a personal God. He's very much near them. They can see him, touch him, as we shall see, smell him. They feel close to him. Forget Vaikuntha or the milk ocean. Āḻvārs like Kulasekara Āḻvār and Nammarva can be seen pining to go to Sri Rangam and have a glimpse of the deity. So the image in the shrine gets more importance as the time goes by. One of the later Āḻvārs, Tirumangai Āḻvār, is much more focused on them than the early Āḻvārs, for example. And he mentions, I think, over 60 shrines throughout the subcontinent. We can see this. All these places later on were termed as the Divyadesha, sacred lands, and turned into pilgrim spots. You can still go to these places. Here you can see all the images of the archa murtis of all these temples. What I would like to mention, though, is that the Āḻvārs constantly link this form of God with the supreme form of God, and sometimes with one or the other avatars as well. Let's have a look at the example. Let me keep an eye on the time as well. So this is a verse from a lullaby to Rama, composed by Kulasekara Āḻvār. And there are three locatives here. The middle one is for Rama, that's an avatara, whom he links up with the creator of the world, that's a para form, and then to a deity in a local shrine from Karnapuram. So Rama happens to be here, is the same as the supreme being who creates, but also the deity in the local temple in Karnapuram. And the fact that I think they can see their Lord, their God in a temple, so close to them, decked up in the shrine. It's probably one of the reasons why the Āḻvārs ecstatically describe his attributes, especially the physical ones, as we shall see immediately now. And it's a very, very important, I think, attribute, kind of attribute. Now, because, when you have a form, it means you have physical attributes, which is what seems to attract the Āḻvārs to the Lord, at least initially, which I detect from their descriptions. Perhaps because beautiful forms appeal to their senses. Let's have a look at examples. I'll just go very quickly. I won't tarry too long. God's beauty appeals to all their senses, I think, especially the visual. So sometimes the Āḻvārs enjoy the overall beauty of God, as you can see here, or the different parts of the body, like the strong arms, or here, for example, the red lips, the red eyes. And they also enjoy him adorned with, they describe his jewelry, the garland that he's wearing, but also the weapons. We can see the weapon here that is listed among his limbs, the discus that shines in the battlefield and the conch. Now, the weapons, obviously, they fight, they kill the enemies, but for the devotees, presumably, they look more like adornments because they're not here to punish the devotees, right? So the Āḻvārs enjoy also that. Of course, apparently he's also very fragrant because he wears these garlands, etc. And Andar, the lady Āḻvār, says, oh, does the lips of Bhagavan, do they smell like camphor or the lotus fire? Do they taste like sweet nectar? She asks. And then, of course, many of the Āḻvārs say that he is so sweet. He is some kind of nectar that never sates. And then he's like very sweet music as well. And he's delicate, soft to the touch. So we can see that his physical attributes help the Āḻvārs feel as if they're truly present with him. He's a real person who enthralls their senses. So much so that Tripanarva, in his last verse, after he describes Ranganatha from foot to head, declares that he won't see another thing, he says here, which is likely to be something from this material world. So this is an important reason, I think, for God to have physical attributes, and that is to rally our erring senses and channel them towards himself, which in turn will lead to liberation. Barely telling people to curb their senses is not going to be as fruitful as helping them focus on something equally attractive, perhaps even more attractive, but definitely worthy, such as God's body. In a way, these qualities might even be more important than the non-physical ones like omniscience or omnipresence, which we shall focus on in a minute. And perhaps for the same reason, the Āḻvārs don't say much about the formless God. They don't have an issue with God being without a form. Here in this quotation, for example, they say that having a form or being formless are both his attributes. But how is that going to be useful to the average human being? Anyway, I think that's why they don't really bother to say that much about the formless form, if I may say so. Anyway, let's now turn our attention to his more subtle attributes. As I just said, he has some of the core attributes that we find across belief systems, like he's omnipresent, he's omniscient, he's omnipotent. And I think we know that because we understand that from the fact that he creates and swallows the worlds, for example. And I also think that part of his omnipotence is the fact that he can give liberation, which is something that the other gods cannot do according to the Āḻvārs, because it's quite something to extract a soul from samsara and grant them liberation is a tall order. Anyway, it seems to me that these are qualities that the Āḻvārs often associate with the supreme forms. Not that the Avataras or iconic forms do not have these, right? They describe Rama as granting moksha to Jatayus, for example, but still, it is rather baby Krishna who's seen to be the simple little baby who's crying helplessly, not the Lord of Vaikuntha. So clearly, some of the qualities are better suited for some forms of God, or even though all the forms, represent the same God. There are other qualities like he is beginningless, he's endless, and his excellence is infinite. He's completely faultless, they say. And there are some personal qualities as well. So he is, I think they are more often associated, like with all his forms, definitely, but perhaps slightly more with his avataras and iconic images. There are no clear-cut rules, actually. It's just an impression that I get. He's merciful, he's very generous, he's affectionate, especially towards the devotees. And he's also very impartial when it comes to his devotees. And he has a lot of courage and might, for example, when he tackles the asuras and the rakshasas. For it is not enough to have compassion if you don't have the capacity to help someone, right? And if you have the capacity to defend the downtrodden, but you don't really care because you're not compassionate, that's not going to be useful either. So it takes a perfect being like God to do both. Say the later Sri Vaishnava Acharyas, who consider the Āḻvārs as their predecessors. And my idea is that the Āḻvārs did not expressly explicitly, but it was somewhere in their minds. But I digress here. Sorry, let me get back to what I was saying. These qualities make sure that the Āḻvārs hero worship God, for he is the perfect being, you see? And they feel reassured that they are in safe hands in this world and beyond. So who knows how they would feel, how would they have felt without God having these qualities? Well, we don't really know. And also, although they don't say it very explicitly, the Āḻvārs could be offering this delightfully Saguna that we mentioned earlier on, this Saguna God, who's a personal God and a personable God, as an alternative to the Nirguna God put forth by other systems. And also there were those people who didn't believe in God, etc., Advaitins, Jains, you name it. So they're probably just delighting in the fact that they can do this. And yet, while these qualities might attract and enthrall the Āḻvārs, I don't think they are necessarily the reason why the Āḻvārs hold on to God. Here, for example, Kulashekara Āḻvār says that even if God doesn't accept him or show compassion or even hurts him, he will still be devoted to him. For, he says, he is his servant. Because God is his natural master, the Āḻvār would be devoted to him, even if he seems bereft of some of his qualities like affection and compassion. For example, another example, just because baby Krishna betrays a lack of omnipotence, he's not able to get away from the mortar, and just because Rama doesn't seem to know who he is, it won't make them lesser gods in the eyes of the Āḻvārs. Certain qualities are definitely more appropriate for certain forms of God. That's why I think that God cannot necessarily be identified with his qualities, at least not all of them. Anyway, I'd like to now go back to the verses that I show right at the beginning. Remember when they say that no one can know God, not even himself. What of them? Well, after claiming that they can't know or speak of God, Nammarva and the other Āḻvārs actually have proceeded to do just that, as we saw. Perhaps, I think, some of his aspects cannot be known or spoken of, but surely a part of him, some of his aspects, some of his forms, allow them to be known, to know and speak of him, especially if they are true devotees? Maybe. So who can know? Well, Tirumarice Āḻvār here is one of the early Āḻvārs, like very, very cheeky poet. He says that, he claims here that his mind is matchless because he knows who God is and no one else does. And in this quotation, Nammarva wonders in a rhetorical question whether anyone who knows Narayana's nature could possibly become someone else's servant. The answer obviously is no. Since he repeatedly claims elsewhere that he is Narayana's servant, we can presume that he is Narayana's servant precisely because he knows who Narayana's real nature. And the more devoted he is, the more he probably knows God, which enables him to speak of him, which he does. He composed more than 1,000 verses after all. Okay, I think it's time to move on. Now we move on to the final part that deals with the concept of monotheism among the Āḻvārs. We see that the Āḻvārs love this one God, Narayana, many names, many forms, albeit his many forms, as I said. One of them, however, Toṇṭaraṭippoṭi Āḻvār, is so fiercely monotheistic that he does not even mention any other deity from any other Vaishnava temple other than Sri Rangam. He's written 53 verses. It's Ranganatha, Ranganatha, Ranganatha. So I just put this picture. It's always Sri Rangam, not even these two. No, it's anathema. He won't even do that. Not the other Āḻvārs, clearly. But even he does not deny the existence of other lesser gods, whom they all mention, like Shiva, Brahma, Indra, etc. However, we see that Tirumangai deprecates the other gods. He says that they are spit out gods because Bhagavan swallowed them during Pralaya and then spit them out. And then Toṇṭaraṭippoṭi Āḻvār clearly says that he established them to play their roles, whatever their attributed roles. And then finally, in the Nanmugan Tiruvandadi, Tirumarice Āḻvār warns people of pseudo-gods. And yet, having said all that, there seems to coexist alongside this monotheistic system a sort of subcult of another set of people, a subcult that steadily seems to grow in importance in the Āḻvār poetry. And what is that, pray? So here I'm going to deal with the peculiar case of Maturakavi Āḻvār. He is It's a very peculiar case. So he has written a work of 11 verses, and in that set of verses, he declares a preference for the Lord of Kurugur, he says, in the south, over God himself. Now, who is this Lord of Kurugur in the south? Not an epithet of Narayana, but actually it is a reference to Shatakopa, later known as Nammarva. So this Āḻvār, Maturakavi Āḻvār, proclaims devotion to another Āḻvār. So throughout the decade, he declares having become a servant of Nammarva and swears allegiance to him. He says, I do not know another God. So the object of his monotheistic worship seems to have shifted from Narayana to Nammarva. But why? He says that Nammarva doesn't reject or scorn him. He's like a father and mother put together. The quotations here, as you can see. Well, so it's not God who's the father anymore. Did God reject him, we wonder? And then moreover, he says that Shatakopa removed his karman, he says. And we all know that when karma is removed, it means that moksha is going to be achieved anytime soon. So basically, Nammarva is presented as an alternative to God. Or is he? And why is he so important anyway to Maturakavi? And how did he manage to remove his karma? Well, that's the last bit here. He says that Nammarva taught him the meanings of the Vedas, which presumably gave him knowledge that will liberate him eventually. So here, the role of the teacher emerges. So the figure of the teacher who's compassionate, affectionate, and powerful enough to get liberation for another is something that almost, I think, begins with this Āḻvār, and then it keeps growing later on. And something similar can be noted in the other Āḻvār's poetry as well, although they do not exclude God himself from their focus. For example, it makes us wonder whether their monotheism, is flawed or something. Here, Kulashekara Āḻvār says that he wishes to bathe in the dust from the feet of the devotees. And here, Nammarva wishes to serve the devotees, etc. of God. And then finally, Periyarva goes to the extent of claiming that the devotees have the right to dispose of him as they want, even sell him if needs be. So the devotee also emerges as an important figure here, who is worshipped by these Āḻvārs. So is this a parallel cult? Does it not undermine a devotee's faithfulness? What happens to the concept of monotheism then? Nothing to worry, really, because as Tirupāṇārva declares, he says it here, it is God himself who made him a devotee to his other devotees. And Tirumangai also here points out the contrast, the stark contrast actually, between being devoted to other deities, presumably Shiva, etc., but also to the contrast between that and being devoted to God's devotees, clearly not the same thing. And in the case of Nammarva, Maturakavi claims that he's a devotee of Nammarva. And Nammarva himself, remember, he said he's a devotee of any devotee of God. So basically, Maturakavi is doing what Nammarva suggested, that is, being devoted to God's devotee. So all this devotion to the devotees and to the teacher, who likely was also a great devotee, all this has the blessings or even the recommendations of God. So it cannot possibly harm monotheistic devotion. And the later Sri Vaishnava Acharyas also explain that the devotees and the teacher are at the feet of God. So they are like God's feet by extension. And also the Tamil word adiyavan, which means servant, by extension, devotee, comes from the root adi, which means foot. So you see, when you worship God's feet, you're not going to think that you're worshiping somebody else, right? Because God is not different from his feet. So, oh my God, I've spoken so much. So I'm going to conclude now very quickly, just a recap of what all the things I've said. As I said, it's not very, very clear still in my mind, but hopefully I'll get a clearer picture by the time I write down the article. So God is Narayana. He has many forms, many activities and attributes, which are all very important because they attract the Āḻvārs and reassure them. While the core attributes make God God, he is not necessarily identical to all his attributes, especially the personal ones, because he doesn't cease to be what he is. And we also saw that the core of the monotheistic devotion is not jeopardized by worshipping the different forms of God or his devotees, who in a way are part of him. Thank you so much for your patience. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the wonderful talk. So now we have time for questions. Please raise your virtual hands. Okay, so I have a question then. So this time I will be quick and ask my question. You mentioned the beginning, mainly the beginning. I mean, you used the word perfect being, right? And when you showed us God's qualities according to the Āḻvārs, you mentioned like omnipotence, for instance. And I was just wondering, because some people they link like perfection with infinity, in the sense that an omnipotent being is a being who has infinite power, right? And you also mentioned that God is merciful, has mercifulness, generosity, affection. So I was wondering first if these other qualities, they can also be associated with the concept of infinity, in such a way that God is not only merciful, but infinitely merciful. And if this comes like in explicit way in the Āḻvārs, if you find some direct reference to the concept of infinity, that is infinitely powerful, for instance.
For some of the qualities, some of the attributes like omnipresence and omnipotence, etc., definitely there's the concept of infinity. He is also infinite. They say Adi, Anadi. No, they don't use the term Anadi, actually. They say he's the Adi, he's the cause, and also he's Ananta, endless. But I have never seen the infinity applied to his mercifulness, for example, because they always are very gleeful in their description of how he massacres the Asuras, for example, right? This comes later on. With Ramanuja, it comes later on, because whatever he does, even if it seems horrible, it is out of compassion, because he wants to help them and take them to liberation. But I suspect that I haven't quite seen that. So some of these qualities, perhaps the fact that he is not so very kind to Kamsa, for example, is precisely a quality, right? Imagine he was so kind to Kamsa that he allowed Kamsa to kill everyone. That's not a quality. You see what I mean? They don't say it explicitly, but I don't think that they associate this quality of infinity with all the qualities, with all the attributes. Some of them definitely. Powerful, yes, he's infinitely powerful. He is infinitely, he knows absolutely everything. He is the very knowledge, etc. Yes, but, and also for impartiality, not with everyone. That's why I think I made a point of saying, yes, he's impartial when it comes to devotees. He's very affectionate when it comes to devotees. I don't know if I've answered your question.
Yeah, you did. Thank you. Now, please, Professor Srinivas, your turn.
Yeah, Suganya, it was very nice talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I have a question. In continuation of the same question that is raised by my predecessor, if the God and his attributes are not identical, and then someday some of the attributes may disappear, and as one day he may become merciless, and another day he may become merciful, and it's very, God is not a very absolute personality. He can change any day. How do you define it?
Thank you for this question, because this is something that I was thinking over for the past few hours, because I wasn't planning on speaking about this. I hadn't given it a thought till I was listening to, I think, a talk a couple of days ago in this very forum. So initially, my conclusion was that the core values like omnipotence, etc., at least they, you definitely have to identify them with God, because if he doesn't suddenly have omnipotence, then some other God might have it, etc. But then I thought, I'm still thinking about all these things, so I do not have a clear-cut answer. What I thought was the Āḻvārs definitely give examples of contexts where he is devoid of some of the qualities. For example, Nammarva says, you lack compassion. You're just horrible. He says, Andar says, you're horrible. he doesn't cease to be Krishna, right? He doesn't have compassion, but he doesn't stop being Krishna or God. And similarly, I gave that example again of Rama. Rama doesn't know who he is. He's not supposed to know, but it doesn't make him a lesser God. I don't know if I make sense. I'm still thinking these things over. I'll think about this. Maybe, I don't know, maybe these qualities do define him, but these qualities are not him. I think I'm very much influenced by Ramanuja's theory, you know, about there is God and everything else, Chit, Achit, etc. are his Visheshanas, etc. His gunas are also his Visheshanas. So I'm trying to see what's happening with the Āḻvārs. So I'm afraid that's all I can tell you at the moment, because it's not very clear in my mind to begin with. But thanks very much for that question. Thank you.
If I may comment on that, but perhaps we don't need to identify God with his attributes in order to prevent this situation. Perhaps we just should reconstruct the whole concept of God in such a way that his attributes are essential to him, not accidental. They're not accidental attributes. They are essential attributes, but they are not identical to him. I mean, I think this and many people have done that. I don't know if
that's a very good solution. Thank you.
Okay, good. Then now Alan turn.
Okay, thank you, Suganya. It's very, very nicely presented. Just a quick question, and it's just about, you were talking about God's forms and functions, and I know you're dealing with a lot of different Āḻvārs here and a lot of different ideas, and you're trying to kind of condense them in a sense. But you're talking about the different many forms but one God, and then you mentioned, you know, Narayan and others, and then you mentioned the Lord in the heart, and then you mentioned the Murti, all these different forms. And then there was also non-form, which was not really addressed too much because they didn't address it too much. So two questions. One is, first, the non-form. In what sense non-form? Because you have the kind of the Nirguna Brahman type non-form, where it's just all pervasive. And then you have just some other kind of non-form that I don't know what it could be. And the second question is, how did all these forms kind of relate? Is there some kind of unified idea of how they all relate with each other in some way? That's just trying to clarify for myself.
Okay. For the first question, thank you for those questions. For the first question, it's not very clear because, for example, Nammarva in one of the verses says, if you think he exists, then everything around, everything that exists is his form. If you think that he doesn't exist, nothing is his form. See, they're not any clearer than this. And there's this other verse that I quoted, he says, well, he has a form and he's formless. So what? They don't get into details. So I'm afraid I can't say more. I'll try to go through every verse. I mean, there are 4,000, but I'll try to go through them and pick up, every single occurrence where they mention this. Aruvam is the term that they use in Tamil. It comes from arupa. Uruvam is rupa and aruvam is arupa. That's how far I can tell you. And can you yes, your second question was your second question was how they relate all these different forms of God.
How do they relate with each other? Before you go to that one, actually, so back to the formless thing and a different kind of. Do you think that the concept of God is kind of the idea of, is there a paradox involved in it? Is there some kind of contradiction that helps you to get to a better understanding of something that's? I
think it's more like whatever you say, he is what he is. He is going to be that. If you're going to say that he exists, well, he exists. If you say he has a form, that's going to be him. If you think that he doesn't have a form, that's still him. So he's capable of taking in all these contradictions. I don't know if I make sense. And I think now that I think this formless being is perhaps an answer to this nirguna God, right? Because form is itself a guna, it's an attribute. So he's probably answering, it's hard to say when he's answering the Jains and when he's answering the Advaitins, etc. So it's probably that.
Mm-hmm.
You don't seem very satisfied with
No,
the
no,
answer.
no, no.
I'm afraid I can't say more.
No, I understand what you're working with. The other question was how all these forms and non-form relate to each other in some kind of unified concept of God.
Okay, I'm leaving aside the formless God, right? The other forms of God, I really like. If you just read Āḻvār verses without looking too close, they just don't make a difference. As I saw in that, as I showed you in the verse that I quoted, like in one of the verses of the lullaby, he says, "Oh Rama, do sleep. You know, you were born to kill Ravana," and then the next line he says, "Well, you swallowed the whole earth." I don't think Rama did that, right? It's almost as, and it's like, oh my dear sweet God from Karnapuram, which is the town, which is a town here in Tamil Nadu. It's almost as if like, no, they didn't see a difference. It's just him, it's Narayana, who for whatever reason that they don't say expressly, is allowing himself to be seen and felt in different forms.
So we're back to the idea of the attributes thing, but they're not the same as the essence. Form can be considered a type of attribute, a guna almost.
Yeah.
Okay, interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
If I may interject, and sorry for that, because Suganya, much of what you said gave me the impression that there is a kind of phenomenological approach at stake, in the sense that God appears in a specific way to his devotee. And if this is true, so can we make a difference between the appearance of God in the devotee's consciousness and like the objective reality of God?
No, I really think that there's God per se, whatever his form, is pure reality. Okay, and I don't know if I'm answering your question. Are you trying to say that some of it is, how am I going to say this? Is a certain form of God like superior to another?
No, in the sense that like Medananda said that God appears in whatever form, I mean, the devotee enjoys. So if this is correct, perhaps we can make a distinction between the appearance, I mean, the way God appears, and the way God really is.
I think the two merge simply.
They're the same.
They are the same. And if I think that God is in this murti, well, he is. It's not just he shows himself here. No, he is there. If I think he's there, he is there. And anyway, he's there because he's omnipresent.
Sure.
So, and again, you didn't ask this in your question, but I wanted to make this point that none of his forms are superior to the other. Just because you're able to visualize him inside your heart doesn't mean it's a superior form of worship than when you're dealing with the Archa Murtis. And the God who appears in your heart is not in any way superior to the Avatara, for example. No, they're all gods. None of them are just representations. They're all gods. If I think that God is, as I said, I don't know, in my hand, like some people look at their hands when they wake up in the morning. So God is there. It's not just, he doesn't appear, he is there. You see what I mean?
Yeah, I do. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I think I have to move on, and I'm afraid that those two questions are our last questions, and I ask you to be brief. So Mirella, please, you can ask your question.
Yes, thank you, Suganya, for this wonderful presentation. My question is about Maturakavi, Āḻvār, because of his worshipping Āḻvār, his teacher, rather than Āḻvār and Vishnu. And just wondering, how does, very briefly, how does the Sri Vaishnava tradition explain his choice or his orientation?
Okay, if I get into the Sri Vaishnava tradition, it's going to take another half an hour. But to be very, very brief, they absolutely love Maturakavi Āḻvār precisely because he's devoted to his teacher, because the cult of the teacher, as I said, is going to get more and more and more important. They are going to establish the Guru Parampara. Ramanuja is an extremely important teacher, and the Guru Parampara goes all the way back to Narayana himself. So Narayana himself is worthy of worship, not just because he's God, but because he's the first Acharya. Okay, so they also make a parallel between Maturakavi and Shatrughna in the Ramayana, for example. Because Lakshmana and Bharata were devoted to Rama, so they were great. But Shatrughna was devoted to Bharata, who was a devotee of Rama. He wasn't directly devoted to Rama, but he, they say, is the best form of devotee because he was devoted to the devotee. And they say Maturakavi is just the same. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Now, Pujarini.
I have just a clarification that when you talk about the different forms of the God, I would like to know that are you talking about the attributes of the God or the character traits of the God?
That's a very good question. I think it's a mixing of the two, because as I pointed out, some of the attributes correspond to some of the forms more than certain other. So, and the Āḻvārs are not extremely clear-cut about that, I'm afraid.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, good. Thank you very much, Suganya. So now I would suggest that we have a short break. I would say 10 minutes if everyone is okay with that. And so we take a break, 10 minutes break, then we come back with our next talk. All right? Good.